Everybody for attending our little session today on assessing your CRM success. Generally, this idea of, hey, we're doing a certain level with CRM. We just want to narrow the gap between where we are and what this image of perfectly done CRM looks like, and that means a lot of things, right? CRM isn't just a piece of technology, although that's an important part of it. It's a process, and it's what's inside the minds of your people, and it's what your culture looks like. It's lots of different things, and getting it right is not just as easy as, hey, have I configured all the different pieces correctly? But that is an important piece of the puzzle. So we're going to tackle all of that today. So why assess our success? Why even look at CRM success overall? I love this picture because if you've ever been out in the middle of the ocean, you kind of get a sense of what it's like to be on the leadership side of a CRM project, right? We set sail with high hopes in pursuit of this adventure, in pursuit of the new world, whatever it is. And now you're in the middle of the ocean, and no matter which way you look, it all looks about the same, right? And you start asking yourself, are we going in the right direction still? Are we really doing what we thought we should do? Are we going to get where we thought we'd set out to go? Is everyone going to mutiny before we get to where we need to go? A lot of sort of similarities with, we're kind of in the middle of the ocean. We might be lost. We might not be. And you start to kind of lose perspective. So I like to say, sorry for my choice of words here, but it might be that your CRM has problems, right? That's one reason why you might want to assess your CRM, and you're not alone if that's the case. In fact, if you look at the statistics here over many years from many people analyzing it, people have had issues with their CRM, and it's not even always clear that they do have issues. Notice that statistic there at the bottom, 47% have attempted to implement 2 or more times and either still haven't gotten it right or finally got it right. Part of the research we did with a client many years ago when they were struggling was, they said, look, we are a global organization and each region has their own CRM implementation. And in the US, we're struggling. So come help us. We've gone through 3 or 4 partners in different iterations trying to get this right. And the first thing they said was, hey, our counterparts in the EU say they've got CRM adoption, that they're successful. Go talk to them and find out what's going on. So we said, great, let's learn their secrets. It's the same company, not even just the same industry. So we set up a phone call. We've got the general manager of the United States, the general manager of the EU, and we're asking questions. And like, yes, we have perfect adoption everywhere. It's been a raging success. And we said, tell us more. How did you do it? And they said, well, we've got this accounting application, and we used to create new accounts in our accounting application, but we've turned the ability to do that off. And now to create a new account in the accounting application, you have to first create it inside the CRM application, and then it'll transfer over. So now everyone has to use CRM because they have to use it to create their accounts. Cool, that's kind of a good story, right? Okay, we found something people have to do to drive adoption. So what else is happening? How is that transforming your business and changing your customer relationships and driving ROI? Dead silence on the other end of the phone, right? So you might actually believe your CRM is great, and it might not actually be great, right? It's very difficult sometimes to understand, where are we? What's working? What's not? And regardless of where it is, the world is changing fast. It was changing fast a year ago. It's changing even faster now. I just got off of a panel discussion call where the consensus of the panel was, we don't all know exactly how it's going to look, but we do know the post-COVID crisis world is going to be different. It's not a matter of, let's just wait for this crisis to be over so we can get back to business as usual. Business as usual has always been a thing of the past. It's always been changing. It will definitely be a thing of the past after this. We're going to be working together differently. And CRM has to respond to those changes. Folks who let it sit and languish for a long time might have had a great CRM system 10 years ago. They probably don't anymore. So this is why we want to look at it. But there's one other really, really important reason, maybe more important than those other reasons, and that is your people support what they help to create. So even if everything else is perfect about what you're doing with your CRM, and when I say your CRM, I don't mean the thing, the software. Let's call it your project, your initiative, your philosophy, your processes, all of those things bundled up. If all of them are perfect, except your people haven't bought into it, they're not going to support it. But if they feel like they're helping with the ongoing process of imagining it and creating it, you're much likelier to get them to actually use it. So that's a part of your assessment. That's the most important takeaway that you can have today is I'm going to give you some tools to do this, but don't take this as here's a thing I do to help improve the stuff. It's here's a thing I do with my team to help draw them in, to get their insights and to get them to buy into actually using this. Okay, quick introduction to me. Very quick, I know I've probably talked to a lot of you before, so you may know a lot of this, but my name is Jeff Abels. I've run a business that does this since just after the year 2000. So we're getting close to our 20-year anniversary, another year or two away right now. I write on this stuff, I speak on this stuff, I kind of geek out on it. I love to see businesses make a difference to their bottom line and to the quality of what their people, internal and external, are experiencing by using digital to do that. There's all my contact information if you want to reach me. And we provide those kinds of consulting services to our clients. And there's the personal side of me. My wife and I are relatively recently empty nesters. Both of our daughters married. We got a dog, Verdi, to kind of help fill a little hole left in our nest by our kids leaving, and that's Verdi on her new little home right next to my home office desk, her COVID home next to me. We love to enjoy good wine and to ride a motorcycle together whenever we can. And there is the newest addition to our family. Meet Theodore Evergreen Tremolini, wearing his cool little onesie that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So we like to get to know each other on a more personal level than just the business. I'd like to get to know you guys that way too. So as we think about how are we going to assess our success, one thing to think about is why are we doing CRM in the first place, right? A lot of people get hung up on, okay, assessing success. Let's look at, are people adopting it? Are people doing the things we want them to do? And that's a dimension, and we're going to talk about that. But it helps to really back all the way up. As Simon Sinek would say, you know, what's your why? Start with why. Why are we doing this? Because if we're going to assess our success, we need to kind of understand where was this ship heading before it left port. And maybe we've learned some new things and it needs to head in a different direction. That's fine too. So I would submit to you these 5 core reasons for any CRM, but I would also submit to you, part of your assessment should be find your own why. Get your people to help you find that why also, because if they're a part of finding that and they buy into it and believe in it, you'll have to get out of their way to stop them from using CRM. You won't have to beat them over the head with training anymore. But if they don't understand and buy into the why, it doesn't matter how good all the what is. So 5 core reasons I would say is you are doing CRM so you can listen better, so you can capture better information about your customers and your relationships. You're doing it so you can go beyond listening to actually understanding. Do the insights, understand the analytics, apply the artificial intelligence. That's why you're listening, right? You're listening to get better information so you can listen to that information and make better decisions, have better interactions, and improve how you connect. How you connect is all about processes that deliver better experiences and better outcomes. And you do all that with the idea of we want to continuously improve. We want to know our results and continuously improve them over time. So listen, understand, connect, and know is our first 4 reasons. Let's make it super easy. CRM is about becoming powered by luck, right? That's the acronym, listen, understand, connect, and know. Now, as we kind of went through and figured this out over a lot of implementations, a 5th thing came up that I'd also submit for you to think about, and we call that good luck. Luck is what you do. Good luck is who you are. It's why you do it. It's the cultural piece of this thing. All 5 of those are going to come into play in the, with what I talk about in just a couple of minutes here. Now, the other thing I'd submit to you for consideration is this. As a project leader, as a CRM architect, as an administrator, as a project manager, as a sales manager, whatever your role is, how do you appropriately support your CRM initiative? Well, I would submit those same 5 things are at the heart of it. Listening to your own people, understanding not just what they're saying that they want, but what is actually needed, which is a very different kind of listening than just doing what people say, listening to the squeaky wheel. And we will talk directly to that in a couple of slides here. and then delivering great user experiences that enable them to do what they want. And by the way, the user is not the front end person alone. The user is the user is the manager of the user is the manager's manager, the user is the executive, anybody who needs to benefit from the idea that CRM is being implemented and the information contained within it. Define that as your user broadly, right? Don't lose sight of that. And then work with them to know the results. How do you continuously improve their experience? So a couple of different dimensions to being powered by luck there. So as we look at all that, when we talk about assessing, what we're really talking about is listening. How do we listen to the pulse of our project to see what's going on? So over some period of time, we've developed a lot of different components for doing this listening, for doing this assessment. We are not going to talk about all those right now. And the write-up, what I promised, is what we're going to do. And that is, we've picked one of those. Oops, I'm sorry. Missed the animation there. We've picked one of those, and that is this idea of assessing based on the voice of the employee, assessing based on survey type of research. We can talk about all those others at some point. In fact, I'd love to hear your ideas on of those other ones that are on that screen. There will be a video shared, so you can go grab those if you want to. I'd love to hear which ones you want to hear more about, but this is one that's resonated with us as an incredibly valuable, cost-effective way to do assessment, right? It's not financially or time-wise easy for most companies to do all 21 of those ideas on the previous page. Everyone can do some form of this. So we're going to try to share with you some of the secrets that anybody can apply to do this well. So when we talk about voice of employee, there's 5 main things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about personas, because not all employees are the same. So how do you understand who these different personas are and what their unique perspective is and how that's going to influence the overall impact of what you're doing with CRM and the overall success of it? Then we're going to focus a lot of time on talking about gaps and gap analysis. Now, if you've heard about gap analysis before, you might be thinking about functional gaps. What we're talking about is perceptual gaps. What's the difference between how satisfied people are with something and how important they think that it is? Because if you don't look at gaps, what you tend to do is just focus on the biggest squeaky wheel, the thing that people are most dissatisfied with. But that might not be the most important thing to focus on. We're going to show you how to figure that out and how to focus on the important gaps. Then we'll talk a little bit about importance, because importance speaks directly to what is the perceived value of the different parts of CRM. And part of what your plan for improvement needs to be is not just closing the gaps and saying, let's get the important parts working better, but let's understand what our team thinks is important and realize that they may not all agree on the important things. And maybe some things that they think are not important, for this to really be successful, we need to change their thinking about that. But you need to figure out what those things are to get them to change their thinking. We'll take a look at that. Then this one, this is a game changer. Stay tuned for this. It'll be about 3/4 of the way through my presentation. The cultural impact. This is one that a lot of people's eyes kind of glaze over. That's too untouchable. That's not meaningful enough. We have found ways to absolutely turn culture into a science, both to influence your culture with CRM for the better, but also to understand your culture and the unique strengths and weaknesses of your culture so that you can use that to help you drive more success. So not kind of saying, well, I'm frustrated because our culture doesn't really embrace this. Every culture has issues with it, but every culture is also different. Leverage your strengths, compensate for your weaknesses. And the only way you can do that is through some pretty unique science for cultural assessment that we'll talk about. And then lastly, benchmark. Don't just do this once, come back and do it again, and ideally even compare it to normative industry data. How are we doing against everyone else's projects out there? But also, how are we doing against ourselves year after year? Remember my opening picture of the boat kind of out in the middle of the sea and everything kind of looks the same? If you do a fantastic job of improving your whole CRM picture over the course of a year, I guarantee you're going to feel the way a lot of our clients have felt, and that is we still feel like we're in the middle of the ocean. We don't know if we've moved in the right direction or not. Benchmarking helps you to say, here are the important things to focus on. Come back a year later and say, have we effectively moved the needle on those important things? So this is not a one-time thing. It's a new habit to get into. start to establish it the right way, and it's going to help to kind of egg your CRM team on a little bit to, instead of saying, all we hear is all the bad news all the time, to be able to say, stop, celebrate, look what we've done well, learn from what we haven't done well, move on into the future. So when you design your survey, there's really 4 or 5 different things to think about with it. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail with this, but I am going to give you a few resources where you can go deeper. So you want to ask profile questions, things about the personas you're engaging with. You want to be able to understand different dimensions of your people. What team do you work with? Are you more remote or are you more office? I know in today's world, we're probably all a little bit more remote. Maybe that will or won't last. You know, are you a heavy computer user? Do you prefer to use a laptop? Ages, genders, all those different things help to drive stuff, not to call people out, but to understand your pockets of strength and weakness so you can partner those together in a way that's going to drive success. Then, remember what I said about why CRM? Here's where those questions come in. Okay, so how important do you think each of these things are? How important is it that we listen and gather data, understand and do analysis, connect with people through better processes, know our results, continuously improve? How important are those, and how satisfied are you that you can do those well? Now, there's a range of questions you ask around that, but they always come in pairs. Number one, how satisfied are you with it? You can think of that as a CSAT type of metric. And number two, how important is this to you? The difference between those two is where your action plan lies, and we'll show you how that looks. Then you have some cultural questions. These are very odd questions, but they come from 30 years of fairly public research that you can tap into. So let's talk a little bit about how you put all that together. One of the first things to remember is, before you go out with that, plan to do a communication plan with this as well. So you don't just want a survey link to show up in everybody's email box and say, hey, please take the annual or initial or whatever it is CRM feedback survey. Just like CRM itself, you need to have a communication plan for this. Depending on your culture, people will respond very differently to it. So what we suggest you do is have a little pre-release briefing before you release the survey. Have a little Teams meeting or whatever meeting type you have to kind of say, hey, look, this is coming. Here's why we're doing it. Your feedback is really important. We promise we're really going to listen to it and respect it. We're even going to tell you what we've learned. Let people know these surveys are anonymous. We're not trying to single anybody out. We're not going to track any identifiable information. What we're trying to figure out how to do is make this work best for our organization and for you as individuals. In your email, remind them of all those things again. Don't kind of say, okay, here's a survey we talked about, but hey, remember, this is anonymous. Some questions are going to be a little bit weird. Please bear with us. Yes, this is 5 to 15 minutes of your time, but it's 5 to 15 minutes really well spent. Same introduction on the opening page of the survey itself. Even considering on your questions, especially some of the weirder ones, having a little link there. Why do we ask this question? So people can kind of click the link and drill into it. I can tell you we've done this for some organizations and everyone just kind of does it. You didn't need to communicate anything. It's a very compliant culture. We've done it with others where there's a general rebellion, where people are saying, I hate these questions. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to answer this. I'm intimidated by it. You're trying to single me out, whatever it is, and it becomes very, very difficult. A good communication plan on the front will forego a lot of those issues, and even the ones they don't. If someone goes and complains to their manager, if you've done a good job of communicating up front, the manager is going to know how to respond back to that complaining person. If there's been no communication up front, they're going to see this isolated question. They're going to go, I don't understand why they would ask that question either. You don't have to fill this out, and you're going to be lost. So make sure you have a good plan in place to take care of that. Now, the survey itself. So what does it look like? How do you design it? At the end of this session, I have a e-workbook or ebook for you called Rate My CRM or Rate Your CRM. I would be glad to send it to you. I will confess it's a little outdated. We developed it 2 or 3 years ago. I've got some new things to share with you today that aren't in there, but it's still going to be a firm push in the right direction. There's a lot of stuff I'm doing today that is in there. So it will help you with some of your survey design questions. But in general, you're going to be looking at 5 sections. One of them is not in the workbook yet. One's going to be the profile stuff. One's going to be more the prioritization. How important is this? One's going to be more satisfaction. You can also alternatively do an effort or ease of use question. That kind of gets the satisfaction from a different perspective. That can be helpful as well. And then the other section that you'll want to have in there is the cultural questions section, which I'll talk about in a few slides here. So usually when I do this live, I actually have people take the survey together, and with the best of intentions, I intended to do that digitally with you guys today, and I just did not have time to prepare that interactive element. So we won't do that today, but actually the survey itself, a very minimized version of it, is in that e-workbook that you can get a copy of from me after this if you want to. There's no, by the way, absolute magic to the questions. We have a couple of hundred that we can draw on. There's a standard battery that we try to put into every survey because we want to collect normative data. And you want to make sure that when you do this, you have standard questions you ask year after year. Because if you don't ask the same question a year from now that you asked right now, you're not going to know if you've made progress. You can change it. You can have some new things that come in and go out, but you need a lot of consistency in it too to make sure you're making progress. So when you send your electronic survey out, this is the kind of data you're going to get back, right? And I realize that's very tiny. That's okay. The point is not that you'll be able to read every bit of it, but let me just point a few things out for you. This kind of raw data just usually comes out of Excel. You can pull out a Microsoft Forms or SurveyMonkey or whatever it is you're using to do your survey. And you can see one line is one person answering a survey. Each cell is the answer to one more survey question. And you can also see things in here like you have these scales like agree, strongly agree, neutral, disagree, that kind of stuff. That's all just kind of words that it's put in here. You also have your satisfaction and importance pairing. So for this particular one, they had things around Outlook integration, mobile access, and a much longer list that went off the edge of the page here. So those are kind of pairs of questions, satisfaction and importance, that are together. What you want to do is to transform the data. So once you get it all out of whatever survey solution you have, you need to have it all in some kind of nice, neat format like this. And you can see what this has done is, it has basically said, all of these questions are really the same surveyee, the same person answering the question, but we've put the importance and satisfaction pairings together so that we can then measure the gap between the two of them. And then we also brought in all the other questions so we can compare those to the gap. And you really need to do several different types of transformations to get everything out that you need to get out. But that's one example of it. If you get into a process of doing it a lot, maybe you've developed transformation tools like we have to do it relatively quickly and consistently. But ultimately, what you're going for is the ability to put simple metrics together like this. Your raw data, the first diagram, you would never be able to just ask this question and get this nice, neat diagram out of it. The transformed data, now in this particular case, I can look directly at it and say, oh, here is the average importance overall, here's the average satisfaction overall, and here's the average gap. So we've got about a 1 point gap, a little over a 1 point gap between the two. And by the way, one interesting item on this one is you can see overall average importance is 4. So on a 5-point scale, with 5 being strongly agree and 4 being agree, most people in general agree that most of the things in CRM are actually important. That's actually a really good sign. We work with some clients who they're kind of thinking, oh my gosh, we need to kind of keep working on the functionality here to get everybody to use it. They run a survey like this and they realize importance is down around a 1.5 or 2. The real work they need to do is help their people to understand, why is this important? How can this help you do your job better? How can this help us to be more successful as a company? So the work had to do with training and communication and cultural change and those kinds of things in those cases. In this case, overall, we look at it and say, this isn't too bad. By and large, people are saying, I want a good CRM. I know most of the things it can do for me are important, but there's a gap between how important I think it is and how satisfied I am with those things. Getting the data and transforming it helps you answer that basic question. But the real gap analysis looks something like this. And I realize this is a bit tiny, but this goes through each, in this particular client's questions, each of their questions, and says, what's the gap? And let's sort it from the biggest gap to the smallest gap. Now, let me point out a couple of really interesting things here. If you were trying to fix the squeakiest wheel, the thing that people were least satisfied with, you would be way down here, right? These two have the highest bars in terms of overall, I'm sorry, that's the highest overall satisfaction. You would actually focus on this first one, dissatisfaction, but you'd probably then come to some others like this one and this one with relatively low satisfaction bars and focus on them. But wait a minute, they're way down the list. Why are they way down the list? Well, because what we're looking at is the gap between importance and satisfaction. And by the way, if you just focused on importance, this first one would also be way down the list, because look, there's not a whole lot less that's rated lower in importance than all customer-facing employees are effective with CRM, right? So you would focus on one of these other things that you say are more important. But we have this huge gap here. Satisfaction is extremely low, and although it's not that important, people are extremely dissatisfied with it. So there's this general consensus of probably I'm not getting what I need out of CRM because not everybody is using CRM the way they should. Or maybe I'm not using it the way I should because maybe my boss doesn't use it the way my boss should, and I'm having to rekey data into something else for my boss. And so why bother? If my boss isn't going to use it, I'm not going to use it either. That's one example. So you can start to see some of these other things over here where you might say, hey, satisfaction looks pretty high here. If I were looking at squeaky wheels, this wouldn't be number 3. But wait a minute, this is tied for first place for importance. So periodic training. Wow, people don't think they're getting enough periodic training, right? They're pretty satisfied with it. I'm sorry, they think it's pretty important, and their satisfaction isn't that low with it, but it's really important. We should focus a little bit more time and effort on that. So I hope you get a sense of looking at this. This really helps you look at and prioritize things differently, where you might have had one set of priorities, just say, we're responding to the incoming complaints as fast as we can, to instead saying, we're getting strategic about focusing on the things where there's the biggest gap that we can close at once. One dimension of looking at a good feedback type of survey. Now, another thing to look at is, well, let's look at the overall importance. So on this particular project, this employee said, this client said, we really want to focus on getting our employees to use this for activity management. We want them to be more strategic about planning their activities. We want them to be more tactical about tracking their activities. We know most of the AI features that we ultimately want to leverage actually depend on that. We know most of the metrics we need around how many calls does it take to close a deal? What kinds of deals are we winning more of? All those things, they depend on reasonably good data entry around activity management. So they took the results of their survey and they sorted it just by importance. And yes, we have satisfaction and gap over here, but they sorted it by importance. And they said, let's highlight in red all the things we think relate to this important corporate initiative we want to drive around this improvement. And lo and behold, all those red things tended to be closer to the bottom of the list, not close to the top of the list in terms of importance, which really illustrated to them that they need to do something with training and communication and education to get people to buy into this, not just to update the functionality to make it work better. And yes, some of those things did have big gaps that they needed to look at as well, but they had this gap in buy-in that was an even more important gap. So really important learning to be able to grab from there. What about our personas? I said we want to kind of analyze and understand our personas as well. So when you grab that persona information, you can start to look at it and start to realize you've got different clusters of people who are behaving differently and have different needs or different experiences. So just grabbing 3 different things, you'll ultimately, when you put reports together, probably have a dozen or more of these things you look at. But here's one. This first one kind of says, well, how is the gap and according to team? So you can actually see the biggest gap overall for this particular company. Customer service had the biggest overall gap for CRM. And the interesting thing is when you look at them, they also did not say we are the most important, right? Executive leadership said, hey, we think we're pretty important. If you look down under sales, they thought they were very important, and rightly so. All those groups agreed. Customer service kind of said, look, we get that we may not be the most important group here, but we're really dissatisfied with what's going on, something you may not perceive otherwise. And this, by the way, came from a group where customer service was not even one of the areas of CRM that they had activated. It wasn't that they were dissatisfied with the customer service capabilities in CRM. Instead, they were frustrated with CRM should help us, help you, and help you to help us. And we're not realizing that gain for some reason. So a lot of focus was able to be put on them to say, we can actually drive a lot of effective change this way. Another really interesting thing, we broke it up by management levels. So we said, tell us how many people you have that you manage. I have no people I manage. I have 5 or more people that report to me directly or indirectly. I manage a small team, or I'm executive and I'm over many, many people. What was really interesting in this particular case is people who had no management responsibility, overall, they were pretty satisfied. Executives, they were even more satisfied. Managers of small teams, they were even more satisfied. Middle managers, super unsatisfied. Really important finding there. Managers in general don't get nearly enough love with training and coaching. Remember that earlier insight I reported where I said people were saying, well, gosh, my manager makes me do stuff differently anyway. Why should I adopt? And what managers were saying is, this is a tool for my users. No one's giving me any coaching or instructing on how to do my job better with this tool. So what happens? Not only am I dissatisfied, I'm a part of the problem. Now we're able to actually identify this and say, let's focus on that particular group. The last one, looking at age differentials here, and no surprise, most of them come back this way. Millennials and Gen X employees tend to find adopting CRM a little easier than our older employees do. But what do we do with that information? Well, there's some great information out there in the form of a TED Talk from General Stanley McChrystal talking about how do I couple some of my faster learners with some of my other folks who have unbelievably great institutional knowledge and relationships, but they need some help with this. There's a strategy you can take and apply. So we call that whole collection of reports the persona gap finder when we do that, but anybody can do those reports. Now let's talk about culture. So this is an unusual one, and it's just tougher to get your head around. What we found, we began kind of, this is something recent. It's not in the ebook that I'll give you. Hopefully we'll modify that and put it in there soon. But it's something that's starting maybe a year and a half ago, we started digging into. Remember I said good luck as a part of this, and good luck is why you do things and who you are. It's not just what you do. That's kind of what culture is. In fact, one of the really interesting things we found was we started trying to look at personality tests, right? The kinds of tests we all take in work, and this is my kind of work habits, or I'm an introvert or an extrovert or whatever it is. And we found that understanding those really didn't change CRM success much at all. It didn't give us, no matter what actions we tried to do, we just didn't seem to get a lot of traction with it until we started finding this research that really strongly suggested, if not outright concluded, that creating an organization, change in an organization, actually transforming what people do and how they think and how they approach their job, it's really about sociology. It's not about psychology. And that thinking over about a 30-year period, obviously not just our thinking, in fact, mostly not our thinking, led to a huge group of questions that scientifically explain culture in a way that makes it actionable from a business leadership standpoint. And it results in sometimes weird feeling questions like you see on this page. And we've got a much longer list. I'll kind of show you the source of some of those lists so you can go inquire of that if you want to. But things like, we don't have many rules about ethics. So people see that on the CRM questionnaire and they're kind of like, what in the world does this have to do with CRM, or even culture in general, right? Results are more important than procedures around here. And they answer on that same 5-point rating scale. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. So people look at those questions and they say, what really does this mean? Well, let's go back and kind of talk a little bit about where does all this come from? So over 30 years, this stuff has been researched, going back to some work that IBM did in partnership with Cornell University back in the very early 1990s. Follow-up surveys co-funded by Harvard and MIT looked at the same information. Bottom line is, it's been validated again and again and again. And we've developed a relationship after finding a person who specializes in this, the gentleman in the upper right-hand corner there, Ivor Plakas out of Cologne, Germany. He has built a career and a business around just understanding this data. And so when we tapped into him and talked about this, he'd been doing it more from a strategic cultural standpoint, very important. We started asking, can this work for CRM on digital workplace, since we do a little more than just digital, just CRM as well? And as we dived into it and started incorporating into our surveys, the answer is a resounding revolutionary yes. But when it comes to those questions, one of the things we found is we as humans want to look at those questions. Me as a guy who's kind of an analytical type of person, I want to look at those weird questions and say, why does this question matter? And for some of those questions, you can answer that. For some, you can't. But just like it says in this article that we pulled out of an issue of Wired Magazine, we have an unbelievable amount of data available to us now. And through all this 30 years of research, what we know is what people do. We know about the culture. We don't always know the why this question predicts that, but we do know it does because we've run predictive algorithms again and again and again and again, and they've absolutely been validated every single time. And I say all this to say, I put all this out there to say, when we do these questions, we will often have our clients saying, show me that question. What does that mean? How does that come up with that? And we talk and try to explain it a little bit. But ultimately, what we know is it works. And the data and the analysis says it works again and again. We candidly don't always know why it works. But again, you can consult those different things that I referred to earlier to kind of understand. So through all this, we've kind of identified a body of cultural characteristics, particularly that relate to CRM and digital workplace. And for each of those characteristics, there's kind of a normative range, right? There's a healthy range. There's not a perfect, if you're here, it's bad, and if you're here, it's good. But there's a normative range. Now, getting outside of that normative range, yes, that's not good. Getting towards the fringes, maybe you need to focus on that. A lot of people, when we run this analysis, say, oh my gosh, how do we change our culture? We do get into some of that, but the point when you're doing this up front to think about the next 6 to 12 months of your CRM project is not how do I change my culture to do better CRM in 6 to 12 months, because cultural change takes many months. In a good day, it takes 6 months to begin to change the culture. On a bad day, it's 9 to 18 months. So do you want to maybe change your culture? Maybe. More short-term thinking is understand your culture and work within its strengths and weaknesses and limitations to be better at doing what it is you're doing. So let's look at one of these. One of these that frequently come up for us, since we seem to do a lot of recovery projects, is this idea of elasticity. So elasticity is this idea of how elastic will I be in getting my job done? And you can actually see, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually kind of serious tongue-in-cheek. On the one far, far extreme is our reality first. You do the things the way we do them, only you do not vary from it. It's rigid, it's structured, and that's the way it's going to be. On the other extreme, it's whatever it takes, get the job done. All we care about is result. We don't care about integrity or ethics or processes or anything like that at all. Now, it's maybe humorous to look at some of this and say, oh my gosh, sometimes it feels like a cult around here. Sometimes it feels like a drug cartel around here. But the reality is, hopefully, very few businesses function those ways. It's normative to be in that range, but outside of those. So a publicly held organization that's subject to lots of compliance and law issues and oversight, they're going to be a little more rigid. That's normal. A commercial organization, a B2B type of organization that needs to move relatively quickly, that might be professional services, they're going to be a little bit more towards the less rigid side of it. And when you understand that, it helps. So what's interesting is a lot of the struggling CRM projects that we wind up engaged in wind up more to the left side of that. They kind of say there's a certain way we've done things forever, and we're not going to be very elastic. We're not going to change to adopt some new way of doing things, even if it might be better. So that's what you're up against. But understanding the other metrics can help to offset that a little bit. And I'll come back and give you more on that in a couple of slides. But that's what we look at across all these attributes. And when you put all of these together, you also are able to start finding other new things. For example, on this page, the question was, hey, we really need accurate data entry. Remember that client that I referred to earlier that said, hey, we really need better activity management and tracking with accurate data entry around this. And so when you look at the left side there, the prognosis, and I apologize, this was done by our German partner, so that comma is really a decimal here in the United States, but that's essentially a score. So you can see those are sorted from the highest capability to do accurate data entry to the lowest capability. And then it looks at green are scores that contribute to the positive prognosis, red are scores that contribute to negative. So if you look at this overall, one of the things you realize is, oh, teams of people, these are not individual ratings, these are team ratings, but you can have segments and sub-teams within your organization. If you're going to do accurate data entry at the highest possible level, you're a highly conscientious team, right? You want to be highly conscientious of doing a good job and a detailed job in what you do. You also value a lot of control, right? A lot of affinity with controlling things, a good thing. You're not necessarily highly ambitious. You're not necessarily focused on, I got to get big things done for the bottom line. I got take care of myself and the things I need to do, and you're okay with a fairly quantitative amount of work, right? A little bit more laborious work. So when you look at that and you think about a sales team, none of those things are true of a sales team. In fact, when you look at a typical profile of a sales team, it's more like down here at the very bottom of this list. Well, probably not super conscientious, probably not nearly as concerned about control, probably highly ambitious, probably not interested in doing a lot of quantitative detailed work overall. So you look at that and organizations start to say, oh my gosh, how do we get our sales team to do this? Well, you could try to get your sales team to do this. Whoops, don't know what I did there. By getting them to be more like this. But the problem with getting them to be more like that is they stop being good salespeople if you do that, right? So some of those things that people might find a little bit off-putting about salespeople might find as off-putting to be on an opposite extreme with other people. But the reality is we need those. Those are good things to have in our organization. But we need to understand our culture to say, so how do we balance that team out? How do we do things with them to actually help them get that stuff done better? Do we simplify their job and make it easier for them to get it in there rapidly? Do we use AI and data enrichment tools to do this a little bit better? Do we have some kind of sales support or virtual sales rep who actually has these types of capabilities but supports our sales team in getting some of that stuff done? And the answer is probably some of all of the above, depending on your specific situation. So another actionable thing to think about with this is something like this. We talked about elasticity. So you may look at your organization, let's say you're a manufacturer. A lot of manufacturers have fairly low elasticity, especially if you've been around for a while. But you might have a team internally that has reasonably high elasticity. So you may say, let's start with team A that has the highest level of elasticity. And by the way, in manufacturers and in highly inelastic cultures in general, that is oftentimes the sales team that has a better elasticity rating than the other teams, which is interesting because they can be one of the tougher ones to get to adopt certain things, but they might have higher elasticity than some of the other internal teams. Then we go, well, you know what? Team B has high horizontal trust with team A. So after we do team A, we can now move this over to team B because they say, we're not really elastic, but if team A is doing it, okay, they've tried it, we're going to go ahead and buy off into it as well. So you start to see now we can start to feed our cultural knowledge into our plan to actually do this better. So it's not just about which cool new things do we install, and I love cool new things, I'm all about the cool new things in there, but it's also about who are we? Why do we do what we do, and why do we do it the way that we do it, and how do we leverage that? And by the way, maybe team B has high vertical trust with the leadership team. So once we create this team A and team B affinity and adoption, now we're ready to start to get our leadership team to say, hey, look, team B did it. They're the 800-pound gorilla of our organization. If they're making it work well, we as a leadership team are ready to start listening to them to do what we do. Now, this is not prescriptive. Every organization is different. If they weren't, you would not need to do all of this research. This research helps you figure out who you are and what your plan is to make all of this happen within your organization. Now, rounding it out, the other thing to remember is that was year one. That was iteration one. You want to come back and keep doing this regularly. You can do it more frequently than yearly. Just try not to fatigue your people by doing that. I would say don't do it less than annually unless you kind of get to a point of maturity where you feel like you don't need to do it as much. So I'd say, about once per year is what you should do. If you are blessed with being in a gigantic organization, you can actually get just sample sizes of your users within your organization and do it 1, 2, 3, 4 times a year, but only hit everybody once per year. So you can kind of watch the needle moving a little bit more in real time than if you're a smaller organization. But if you're smaller, you might need to get everybody engaged. And again, this is statistics. Higher sample size is generally better. So, if you've only got 50 people using it in your organization, I would challenge you to say, try to get all 50 of them to fill out the survey. Even do fun things with them. Even say, hey, when you fill it out, just tell your manager, we're not going to ask you to show us your survey because it's anonymous, but we're going to give you a T-shirt or a Panera delivery certificate. Who knows what it is, but something to help people be on board with doing the work. So now when you look at something like this, the cool thing is you start to say, well, last year our gap. So these are just gaps we're looking at now. Our gap for identifying opportunities that the sales manager can assist with, that was a 2.5 point gap between importance and satisfaction. Look, over a year, we got that down to less than 1.5 point gap. We made some progress. Oh, and by the way, here's the industry normative gap for the answer to that question. So we were below normative last year. We're beating normative now. That gives you more data points to start to say, so now what should we focus on in the coming year? Now, the interesting thing in this case is you can actually see some of the things that that were not high priority gaps in past years have actually changed for the worse, right? So over here we say last year there's a very small gap in terms of identifying skills deficits that we need to help people with. This year there's a very big gap. Now, is that because people's perception of importance changed and it went up? Is it because people's perception of solving problems here went down so that now these gaps were smaller and now this gap rose to the surface? It might be a combination of all those things, but the bottom line is you are now free to potentially focus on other things that weren't as big of a gaps. And by the way, over here, this manage allocations was very, very specific manufacturing group that handled allocations with their clients. That was a custom question for them. So there's no normative data for them to look at in that particular case. So a great way to now come back and say, have we done well, have we not? If you feel lost at sea at the end of the first year, if your management team is saying, hey, we're still hearing problems from people that CRM does not work for us and our forecasts are horrible and we can't do what we need to do, you can come back and say, look, I know we can improve, but look, we did improve forecasting over last year. And by the way, we're already ahead of normative, but we've made even better inroads against that this year. It starts to give you something to say, we are no longer aimlessly in the middle of the ocean wondering if we're doing the right thing. We have concrete evidence showing us we are making progress, we are moving in the right direction. So there's our whole piece. The only thing I'm kind of highlighting here is, remember, all of this is interesting information. It's all useless unless you somehow wrap it up into a plan. Couple of resources for you that I don't have links to. You can ask me via email. I'll try to remember to get them to you, but that might help you with this. So remember I mentioned Ivor Plakis a couple of slides ago. If you want to do a deep dive into that, we had him do a webinar with this group about a month ago, where he really dives deeply into that cultural analysis stuff. You can go search the Dynamics Community's website. You can probably find it. If you can't, I'll be glad to get you a link to that. We also do road mapping sessions, and we talk a little bit more about all these other assessment tools, or at least more of these other assessment tools that you can use. And if you're doing planning, you probably want to do more than just survey and plan. You probably want to use some of those other assessment tools as inputs into doing a good plan. But ultimately, don't do this if you don't have a plan to do a plan, right? If you put a survey out there and just look at it and don't actually change and take action with it, when you do the survey again next year, you're probably not going to be very happy with the results. So put milestones on the calendar to say, here's where we're going to do the survey, here's where we're going to look at the analysis from the survey, here's where we're actually going to put a plan together and execute it, here's where we're going to survey again. And by the way, with all of these different tools, be ready for the unexpected. There's almost always something that's sort of a, we didn't see that coming. And in fact, those are some of the best insights you can get out of these kinds of exercises, is there's something unexpected that popped up that I need to learn from, right? So this is actually a picture I took when we did some more workshop type of feedback, but we had prioritization and voting in it, and the dots were the votes. And the number one thing that came out of a long list of ideas from among essentially the frontline users and their immediate managers was this huge cultural gap. No longer fear retribution for being candid, honest, and creative. So that was a huge lesson learned for that organization to take back and go, wow, I mean, not only did someone put that in there, which is a little bit of a red flag, but when we got the whole team together, by a mile, this was the most highly voted on thing that happened. So is that directly related to your CRM? Well, I can tell you, if your people are afraid to give you feedback about what's going on with the tool that you're trying to get them to use, you're probably not really ever going to get the level of engagement with that tool that you need. Now, you may not be able to get your leadership team to make that a cultural norm. Maybe you will. but you can get your project leadership team to make that a cultural norm, and then you'll stand out as radically different within your organization. So remember, at the end of the day, I love numbers. I'm kind of analytical. We probably mostly are on the call today, technical and analytical and leadership type of people. But remember, it's not about making people feel like a number. It's about proving to people, not making them feel like, proving to people that they count. They know that they count. So take all of this information, when you put it into a plan, go back and share it with them too and go, look, hey gang, I know some of you are probably down on this far end of the chart and said, I have a deep dissatisfaction for this one thing, but listening to the majority, here's the 3 things we're going to focus on based on what you told us. Everybody knows they've been heard, right? Everybody knows they've had an opportunity to count. Now, that poor guy who might have thought Outlook integration, which was the lowest gap thing for everyone else, was more important to them than anybody else, they may feel a little frustrated, but they will still know, I have been heard, I have been responded to, I understand how the priority is set, and I'll probably have a much better chance of buying into that than just putting my stuff into a black box as a suggestion and never hearing anything back again, right? Let people know they've been heard. Let people know that they count. They're much more likely to be on board with you, even if you're not meeting all the different things that they've asked for as a result of that. So thanks so much for coming and indulging me today in this. I know this is not maybe the hands-on technical stuff that sometimes you get from this forum, but I actually think a lot of this stuff that is not technical is some of the most important stuff. In fact, the way I like to think of it is the soft stuff is sometimes the hard stuff. And this is the soft stuff. This is the stuff that's not quite as tangible, but hopefully I've given you some tools today to make it way more tangible, to make it way more scientific, and to give you something you can use. If you want to dive deeper, if you like the luck principle, there's a book on Amazon. Feel free to grab that. I've got a couple of ebooks for you today. I know I mentioned some links. If you remember them, let me know, and I'll send them to you. But if you just want those couple of ebooks, one is called CPR for CRM. The other one is called Rate Your CRM or Rate My CRM. I'm not sure if I got that right. Just email me. I'll get you those resources. And of course, this is the business that we're in. So if you want to engage C5 Insight to assess your success, to put plans to improve together, to tap into our normative database, all of those things are things I'd love to do for you if that would serve you. Thanks so much for coming today. And I think we've got maybe a minute or two for questions.
All right. Thanks so much, Jeff. Great job. Yes, we do have a couple minutes. If you have questions, we'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, no, I don't believe I mentioned at the beginning here, but we did record today's session. We'll get it posted to our content library here within a couple hours. So if you registered for the link or for the session today, we'll send the link to your email directly. So look for that to come. Questions. If you have any, you can raise your hand. And it looks like we have a quiet audience today, Jeff. But yes, you can raise your hand and we can unmute your line. We'd love to hear from you live. Don't be shy. Otherwise, Jeff has some great contact information, many ways to get a hold of him too. Feel free to reach out to Jeff directly. All right, let's go ahead and wrap. A couple minutes to spare. What do you think about that, Jeff?
That sounds terrific to me. Thank you, Laurie.
All right. Appreciate you being here. We look forward to seeing you on an upcoming virtual event. Take care, stay safe, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.